Hi everyone, Asnil here. So Tower of Fantasy just had its global release a couple of days ago. I will be giving my thoughts and impressions for the first few hours of the game. So let's get into it. But by the way, I'd like you to keep in mind that I may be comparing this to Genshin Impact, since that is the closest game that we could compare to, considering this being a gacha game as well as an open world. Without further ado, let's begin. Alright, so the first thing I'd like to talk about are the servers. Compared to Genshin Impact, wherein you would only have the regions to select, in Tower of Fantasy you would need to select which specific server you'd like to start your character. In this case, as you can see, in Asia Pacific there are multiple servers. Now if I pick one, for example in Moon, and create my character there, if I know someone who would like to communicate with me within the game or play with me in the game, if they created an account, say for example in Tenpora or in Fate, they would not be able to interact with me because my character is on Moon. If they log in on that server in Moon, they would not be able to carry over the data they created on their servers. They would need to start from the beginning. So that's something that one needs to keep in mind if they'd like to play with their friends in this game. For me, that's actually something of a negative point in this game. It would have been nice if I could carry over my progress so that I could interact with people from Eden or Nova or Babel or some other server with my current progress. Next is our main character. Compared to Genshin Impact that's story-driven, that we're stuck with Aether and Lumine, in this case, Tower Fantasy is an MMO, and we are given a high degree of freedom in terms of what we want the main character to look like. We can choose between the male, female, and then customize their hair or their facial features. Like as you can see, we could change the bangs. The middle is mostly for female characters, and then the back. As you can see, there's quite a bit of freedom in terms of what you want your character to look like. There's also the sliders if you want custom colors. You can change the top and the rear color for gradient looks like mine. And then you could change the facial features specifically. Let's say, for example, the eyes, you want the brows or the shape, the eyeballs, or enhanced eyes. There's quite a bit of freedom in customization, so that's one thing that I love about this game. In Genshin Impact, if you don't like the main character, you'd have to wait and pull for the character that you like once it comes out on the banners. Next, let's talk about the gacha, or what exactly are we pulling for in these games. Let's start with Genshin Impact. In Genshin Impact, we are pulling for characters based on if we like their visuals or their style or their gameplay. Each character has their own unique trait and skills and weapons as well in Genshin Impact. So in this case, this is the standard banner, the weapon, and the limited time banner. If we want to switch players, we normally just do the quick swap to select those characters and use their skill sets depending on the need. As for Tower of Fantasy, we're actually pulling for weapons, not characters, but they are tied to the characters themselves as well. As you can see, this is the current standard banner for Tower of Fantasy, and since this is sci-fi themed rather than fantasy themed, you could see that we do have multiple weapons here. A bit more broad than Genshin Impact. It does have guns and cannons as well, apart from the usual swords and shields and staffs. Now, when I said earlier that it's tied to the character, it's literally that. In this case, so I could show you that I do have the dagger and the dual guns, for example. These weapons are tied to specific characters based on a bit of a story behind them. There's also what we call the simulacra system, Now this is something that's quite unique in this game. I could use their weapons, but I could also mimic what the characters who own the weapons look like. For example, the daggers is owned by Crow. If I activate, I could play as him in the overworld for the game. Now, if I don't like the looks of the characters, I can simply deactivate the simulacra system. It says you remove the mimicry state. And I could go back to the character that I customized in the beginning, but still use their weapons, including the unique traits of those weapons as well. In terms of character progression, if we want to increase the power of our characters, here in Genshin Impact, we change their weapons, their artifacts, constellation, and talents. In this case, let's start with Kazuha's weapon. Depending on your playstyle, you may want to choose a specific weapon that you like for him, but it also depends on what type of weapon he has, if it's a sword or a bow or a catalyst. And then there's the artifact system in Genshin, wherein we equip them with artifacts that have different stats based on what we want them to wear. The constellation, which is essentially the duplicates in order to strengthen them further, depending on their characteristics, and the talents, wherein we increase the power of their skills. Now, in terms of progression, in this case, we could strengthen the weapons themselves. So you could level it up like you're leveling characters in Genshin. And then as for the artifact system, the equivalent here is the matrices, or the matrix system, wherein we attach these small chips onto the weapons themselves in order to increase specific attacks or abilities. Let's use this as an example. Click on matrices. So as you can see, there are 4 slots that we could input those chips into, and the chips do have set bonuses, so depending on your playstyle, you may want to use those set pieces. In my case, since this is only the beginning, I don't have much set pieces yet that are of high quality. As you can see, each chip actually does have a different stat. In this case, it's HP and crit for this particular slot, but with this one, it's attack and HP. Now, each weapon does have its own slot wherein you can equip them, and each of these chips you can actually level up as well. So there's a bit of depth to it, just like the artifact system in Genshin Impact. Now, as for additional character progression, in this game, we do equip our main character with certain equipments as well, like these boots, these gloves, belt. There are multiple equipments that we could wear, and each one randomly getting some random stats. And we could enhance them as well. See, there's an enhance button and then advancement. So for enhancements, you can increase the base stat of that particular item. And for advancement, you can enhance the random stats that are on that particular equipment. Let's say in this case, the boots. If I click the enhance, it would enhance the attack and the HP. And for the advancement, it went to the random stats, in this case, crit, volt, attack, and attack. So there's a bit of depth to it as well, but those equipment is specifically tied to our main character. The weapons themselves have different stats, and they do have their own chips or matrices that we can equip onto them. Now, a little something that I'd like to lightly touch upon are the animations. Since Tower Fantasy is an MMO, and Genshin Impact is a story-driven game, single player, Genshin Impact tends to have better animations in my opinion, in terms of the cutscenes as well as the movement and the overworld. It feels a bit more natural in Genshin Impact than it is here in Tower Fantasy, at least for me. And that is still very much understandable considering this is an MMO and it's not story driven like in Genshin Impact. The sole focus of Genshin Impact is the story and the gameplay, the combat. But in terms of Tower Fantasy, since this is an MMO, there's quite a bit of the social aspect of it focused. Now, when you actually look at it, it doesn't seem that bad. One could say it even runs smoothly in terms of the animation. But if you are coming from Genshin Impact, I guess you could call it some kind of micro expressions or micro movements that you wouldn't normally notice, but you'd feel it's there. In Genshin Impact, it feels very natural, but in Tower Fantasy, for me at least, it feels a little bit stiff, but it's not that noticeable, so it's only something that I noticed that I'd like to lightly touch upon. Next is the relic system. In Genshin Impact, we simply just have the glider, which we use to glide around Mondstadt or Liyue or Inazuma. But in this case, in Tower Fantasy, the equivalent we have is a jetpack, but there's so much more than just that. There are multiple equipment here called relics that allow us to traverse the world or even attack and defend ourselves, even more than just the weapons that we have. So, for example, in Genshin Impact, we do have the glider to glide down, but in Tower Fantasy, we use the jetpacks. But it doesn't just glide down, it could actually jump up. As you can see, there's a bit more height to it, and then there are other artifacts that you could equip at the same time. Let's say, for example, I'll be using the jetpack to jump up, and I'll be using the cybernetic arm. The cybernetic arm allows me to grapple to a location. See? Or I could use it to propel enemies towards me. So when you're running around the overworld, that's something that's very useful as well. But aside from that, there are multiple relics that we could use. For example, this jet board allows us to, for example, use it like kind of like a hoverboard on top of water, so you don't have to swim. Or this cloak that allows us to be invisible for a few seconds. And this missile barrage, which allows us to use it and destroy certain objects that are blocking the path, provided that they are destructible, or attack enemies themselves. So there are multiple items here that even I haven't unlocked yet. As you can see, there is a bit of depth regarding the relic system that we don't actually have in Genshin Impact. Then lastly, I'd like to talk about the mounts or guilds and something like that that you would normally find on MMOs. Before that, let me just take care of this mob. Okay, so in terms of mounts that most MMOs have, the first one that we get here are these things, the bikes, that you could use to travel the overworld. They're actually quite nice, and it's nice to drive around the world map. Now, aside from that vehicle, there are other vehicles here that we can unlock, depending on your preference. So there's quite a few choices there, and for all we know, they could add more in the future, wherein in Genshin Impact they don't actually have mounts, considering it's a single-player game. This is a multiplayer MMO. Now, aside from the vehicles, we do have the crew system, which is essentially the guild. So there's stuff like that as well, which is more focused on the MMO aspect of the game, which is to interact with other players as well. So all in all, there are a lot of different features on Tower Fantasy that is not in Genshin Impact, as well as stuff that Genshin Impact does better than Tower Fantasy. In my opinion, Tower Fantasy is a very great game, but it's going to be my secondary game compared to Genshin Impact since that's currently my main game. And whenever there's no content or I've already cleared most of the content in Genshin Impact, I will be switching over to Tower of Fantasy. Now, in terms of the world map, this is actually the entire currently allowable world map that we could go to. Right now, as you can see, I haven't unlocked this portion yet. It's actually very big. But the problem is, once we've unlocked the whole continent, we're not really sure if this is it or if they're planning to add more expansions. We really don't know yet. But we do know for Genshin Impact that they plan to release new regions depending on their updates. For example, the new content that would be released is Sumeru, and they would be releasing an entire new region. So that's something to look forward to in Genshin Impact. But here, we don't really know yet. So at the moment, this is all of what we could explore. So I've teleported to this area over here. As you can see, I could see the other parts or regions in the distance. And then, for example, if I'd like to travel, I could just use the bike and go for a long drive. And then get whatever loot I could come across or fight the mobs I come across. See, you can't really do that in something like Genshin Impact because it's mostly on teleport, or you'd have to run through the world. In this case, there's also an option to drive through the world. Alright, so basically that's it for my first impressions for Tower Fantasy. If you'd like to try it out, it's a free-to-play game. You could just go ahead and download it. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you'd like to watch my gameplays, I'm available over at Switch. Alright, thanks for watching, guys.